Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to this virtual public conference of the Spiritual School of the Golden Rosy Cross. These conferences are normally done over the course of 1 hour. The first half of it we use for an introduction of the subject, and the other half for, a session of questions and answers, questions that we try to address obviously within our limits and our possibilities. The school of the Golden Rosy Cross is an international school. It is present in more than 40 countries today, and because of that, these conferences, they are held by individuals that are not necessarily native English speakers, as it is the case of tonight's. So we count on your kindness, in relation to our accent and to some, broken English that we may use. So we apologize in advance to you. But we hope that we can all communicate heart to heart based on our common goal, that is, the quest, the search for the universal truth that knows no frontiers and no boundaries. A couple of words about the Golden Rosy Cross, about the meaning of the school and the objective of the work. And if you allow us, we could use the very name of the school to explain that. We talk about a spiritual school. So let's start with the concept of school. Why a school? Well, first of all, because we are not a religion, we are not a cult, we are not a sect. We are, in essence, a school, because in this school we are all pupils. Since the moment that we join this working proposal until the end of our journey, because we understand that we must continue open, we must continue prepared to learn all the time, one from another, and also because we don't have external masters or gurus, and the process proposed by the spiritual school is followed in absolute freedom and self-responsibility. And actually, we only obey to one authority, that is the inner authority of the spark of the spirit that is present in every human being, in every human heart. So, in our understanding, the spirit is not someone, is not an external, lofty being, a divine being hidden somewhere in the clouds. No, the spirit is not something external to the human being or to anything. The spirit is the omnipresent driving force of the universe, the power that is behind everything that is manifested. So, it is based on this spirit spark that the process of the Golden Rosy Cross is carried out. Now, why Rosy Cross? What is a Rosicrucian? The rose and the cross. The rose represents this universal principle, the spirit spark in every human heart, that could be seen symbolically as a rose, as a seed of a multidimensional universe that may unfold into a totally new and absolutely fantastic life. So the human being is represented by the cross. And the effort, the life effort of a Rosicrucian is to unite the rose and the cross and make the time and eternity, the material human being, the personality, in full unity with the rose, with the spirit spark. Through the transmutation of his or her entire being. The transmutation is represented by the symbol of the gold. The gold is the most noble of the metals, and it represents the product of an alchemical process. An alchemical process that is the process that transmutes all the aspects of our lives, symbolically all the other metals of our being, our thinking, our will, our feelings, and our actions, into the purest of the metals, that is the gold of the Spirit. So, in essence, that's the idea behind the name and the working proposal of the spiritual school of the Golden Rosy Cross. So now let's move to the theme of tonight. The title of this conference that says, and that, in a very instigating manner suggests, don't follow the path, be the path. Well, to begin to address this theme, it is important to recognize that we are all living in a very, very special moment in these days of the history of mankind. We have many names for this moment. One very common esoteric name for the moment we are all living in is the Aquarian Age. We could go through detailed cosmologic and esoteric explanations about it, but the simplest and most direct way to explain this is that we are living in a collective awakening moment. A moment where, after countless turns in the wheel of reincarnation, in the wheel of life and death, the human microcosm is filled with experiences, with a treasure of experiences. Some of these experiences we would classify as good ones, some as bad ones, but the sum of these experiences allow that countless human beings that live in countless microcosms as personalities are touched by the spirit spark that has awakened in the heart of the microcosm, in the center of the microcosm. These human beings, these self-aware human beings, have awakened to the fact that life is something that goes way beyond the day-to-day challenges, the material challenges, the struggle to survive, the struggle to have our relationships, the struggle to grow as an individual, and even the struggle to leave a legacy when our days are over. So life, true life, speaks as a silent voice in the very heart of these human beings, in this self-aware human beings, where the spirit spark is active. So in this moment, when the veils in front of their eyes fall down and they realize that they were living like in a pseudo-reality, in a reality that only hides the true reality that they feel as an intuition that is behind that, then they become a seeker of the truth, a seeker of true justice, a seeker of true beauty, of a real balance in life, of the real meaning of life. Actually, in this situation, no one chooses to be a seeker, because seeking for the truth or not, in that sense, is not a choice. It is a need. It is as if we needed air to breathe, And these seekers, they need to seek for the truth because this is the air for their soul. These seekers then begin a path, a quest, their search, the search of their lives, the search for the truth, for beauty, for justice, for balance. It doesn't matter the way we want to call that. And at the very beginning of this path, these seekers have a major obstacle, a major stumbling block right in front of them. And this is common to all of us. That stumbling block, that obstacle, could be described as our very state of consciousness. Because if we are living a collective awakening moment, we also must recognize that for the vast majority of humanity, we are living based on a very particular state of consciousness. A state of consciousness of full identification with our ego, with our little selves that in delusion we see as a separate being from the all. So everything is done, everything is pursued, everything is perceived through the lens of this separate consciousness. The separate consciousness that puts the human ego in the center of everything. And that's why we call this state of consciousness of an egocentric consciousness. The egocentric consciousness is an obstacle because we believe that as the center of all life, we can utilize our capacities as a human being to try to develop and to put in practice this impulse that eventually subconsciously or even on an unconscious manner that we received from the spirit spark that became active in the center of our microcosm, in the center of our hearts. So the egocentric consciousness will try to become this new man, will try to put in practice through its egocentric life the eternal vision of the new life. Theoretically, we can recognize that this is impossible from the outset. But in reality, we must understand this not only theoretically, but we must understand that this is impossible until, our bones, until, it becomes a reality in our own blood. So that's why the human being in this path normally starts through an external search. A search that he may believe it is already internal, like an inner search. But in essence, it is an external search because he's still outside of himself. He's still identified with the external reality, believing as a baby that, his clothes or her clothes are part of his own or her own body. So, as we see in the myth of Apollo and his chariot, we have as human beings 4 main capacities symbolized by the 4 horses of the chariot of fire of Apollo. Those powers, those capacities are our thinking, our will, our feelings, and our actions. And the egocentric consciousness identified with that external reality, believing that his or her thoughts, desires, feelings, and actions or reactions are actually part of, his or her being, will try to use those capacities to develop, to overcome himself or herself, to go beyond the limits of his or her own egocentricity by utilizing his own egocentric or her own egocentric consciousness. So, if this particular human being is stronger in his thinking, he may start, going through this external path through knowledge, through the accumulation of all available knowledge of the universal teaching that speaks about this liberating path in every civilization, in every country, in all the times, in all periods of history. But after maybe a short or a long period of time that may extend through several lives, this human soul will finally recognize that the accumulation of knowledge per se cannot be a liberating path. Instead, if this accumulation of knowledge is too heavy or long enough, it may end up becoming another hurdle, another obstacle that will need to be overcome, just like the egocentric consciousness is an obstacle to begin with. If this particular human being has a strong will, he or her may decide to try to put in practice this path through the external path of putting in practice, all sorts of esoteric, occult, and magic exercises to try to develop hidden powers, hidden capacities. In essence, to unleash the hidden power that lies within himself. But actually, as we also see in the mythology of the old Greeks, unleashing this power is compared to the son of the god, of the sun god, taking the chariot and losing control of it. So this human being will end up becoming prey of these powers, will end up becoming a victim of everything that he wanted to control in the first place. And in the end, the conclusion should be the same, that the path cannot be based upon that kind of esoteric, occult, or even magic development. A supersensitive human being, on the other hand, someone that has access through his supersensitive feelings to the subtle worlds, the astral world, the etheric world, that are the layers of energy that circulate around us. This human being may try to experience the path through, sensations, through the contact with these subtle spheres. And he may end up believing that these spheres are, the nirvana or the heavens or some sublime sphere of life. But after a shorter or longer period of time, this human being will also recognize that all these spheres, although they may seem sublime and extremely lofty, they are nothing more than a mere reflection of our own state of consciousness. Because the universal teaching, explains this since, the dawn of times. And now, modern science also recognizes a state of consciousness creates a state of life. And an egocentric state of consciousness will only create an egocentric state of life, regardless if it is on this side of life in matter or on the other side of life after we lose our physical body in the subtle spheres of the etheric world or the astral world. And lastly, a human being may be extremely geared towards action. And this person may try to put in practice this liberating path through the training of his personality, through the training of his behavior, through the training of his own ego, to try to make it better, to try to make it wiser, to try to make it stronger, by following, guidelines, by following directions of an external guru or an external master, through the imitation of one given behavior. But in the end, after a shorter or longer period of time, this human being may eventually also recognize that by trying to become something that in essence he is not, he's only making his prison, the prison of his ego, bigger, maybe in width, length, or height, but his prison is only becoming bigger and bigger, and the demolition of that prison will become an even harder task to be accomplished. So, what we are trying to say is that after one life or countless lives, this microcosm that is connected to a human consciousness will finally come to a mature and sober conclusion that all the attempts to develop the human ego or to transform the egocentric consciousness into the true liberated human consciousness, they must fail. And this person will finally understand that the true inner path is something that starts when all these external paths end. And then this person, this human being, will finally recognize that the only possible basis for the true inner liberating path is the spirit. Do we mean by that this person will become recluse, that this person will stop thinking or desiring or feeling or acting or interacting with the rest of the world, that this person will fall into a lethargic state of inertia? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That would be, again, very crude imitations of the true path. What happens is an inner change, an inner transformation that transforms the external reality. So it's not by forcing external artificial changes. It is to start with a fundamental recognition that our egocentric consciousness is not a possible base for development. And when this person comes to this conclusion by himself or herself alone, then the true inner path may begin. This inner path starts by the center of the microcosm, the spirit spark, touching and gradually awakening the human consciousness, the nucleus of the human consciousness. That is just like a twin that stands in the heart of the microcosm in front of the spirit spark. This center of our awareness, this center of our consciousness, symbolically speaking, of our soul, as our consciousness was called in the past by many, this center of our consciousness can gradually become free from its own identification process through a sober process of self-observation and self-knowledge. By recognizing how deeply enchained he or she is. And then after this process of recognition, that must become like a second nature to the human consciousness, then the transmutation, the transformation of the centers of the human consciousness themselves may begin. We can recognize three main centers of our awareness that lie in our heart, in our head, and in our hands, in reality. So these are the three aspects of the human consciousness that can be actually transformed through the action of the fiery center of the spirit spark in the center of the human microcosm. And after the human consciousness has become new, renewed through the action of this universal principle, through the action of the spirit spark, we can call this consciousness a new consciousness, a new soul, a new spirit soul. And this spirit soul then can actually begin the alchemical process, like a newborn alchemist inside of the microcosm. And this process of alchemy will finally go through the transmutation of all our four basic human capacities: our thinking, our will, our feelings, and our actions that correspond to the four vehicles, to our four bodies, as described in the universal teaching. The mental body, the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical body. And when this process is carried out sufficiently, then the barrier between time and eternity can be gradually overcome. Not that we are going to vanish from the surface of the earth, or that we are not going to be the human beings that our family, our friends, and our communities know. We will have gone through an inner revolution. And this inner revolution will finally have transformed us into catalysts of a bigger change, of catalysts of the change, of this very change that must become a reality for all humanity. And to conclude, this process is what we clearly see represented in the symbol of the Golden Rosy Cross, the symbol that is here right in front of you. Everything begins with the point at the center. The point represents the active spirit spark in the heart of the circle, in the heart of the human microcosm. And when this spirit spark becomes active, then the human consciousness, the human soul, represented by the triangle, that indicates, as we said before, our heart, our head, and our hands, can actually be transformed and rebalanced. Not only driven by the spirit, but reunited as the creative powers of our consciousness, but also in balance. And the point and the triangle, the spirit and the new soul, can finally transform the human manifestation, the human reality the human vehicles, the human bodies. The mental body, our thoughts. The astral body, our will. The etheric body, our feelings, our perception. And the physical garment, the physical body that will then carry for as long as possible the inner image of the true, new, liberated human being. And then, once again, we get to the circle, because there are no longer boundaries between time and eternity. We know that all this may sound a little bit distant, especially when we look at our lives, our tiny little lives as human beings here in this planet, trying to fight our way through our daily battle. But, dear friends, in essence, this is a possibility, this is a promise that is lying, that lives in every human heart. And actually, the whole objective of the Aquarian Age, if we are able to live long enough as mankind and continue with the historical process long enough, this is the possibility that awaits for every single one of us. And this is also the working proposal of the spiritual schools of all times and of the spiritual school of the modern times. We hope that in this approximately 30 minutes, we've been able to summarize to you in this first virtual public conference a little bit of the objective of the spiritual school and a little bit about the theme that we brought to you tonight. And now we'd like to turn to you, and we hope that you have shared with us your questions in the chat window of this presentation, so that our friends that are assisting us can try to inform us and summarize the questions that we will try to address, obviously within the clear boundaries of our limitations. So while I have a small sip of water here, let me try to check the questions that we have so far. Our friend Thomas Floyd Rennie, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Thomas, wants to know what is the difference, or what distinguishes the egocentric consciousness from let's say the new consciousness, or let's say the liberated consciousness. Well, actually, is truly nothing external. If we look at the great enlightened human beings from the past, let's think of Krishna, let's think of Buddha, let's think of Jesus, just to quote some of them. Externally speaking, they were not different from anybody else. But the true power that stems from a human being that has actually gone through this process of change, of transformation, or as the transfiguration process, as the spiritual school puts it, is that an inner source of power, a totally new source of power, starts to flow. And the source of power, we call it the spirit. And the spirit not only, provides the human consciousness, first-hand knowledge, but at the same time, an astonishing amount of energy, not external energy, but inner psychological energy to overcome the barriers of his or her own egocentric barriers. And through the transformation of the human consciousness, of this process that happens inside out, is that we realize, the depth and the breadth of this process. That is why, the thoughts, the words, and even the lives of those that have gone through that process are such a mark, such a landmark in the history of mankind. So, to try to summarize this answer to your question, Thomas, it's not something that we can see from the outside, but it's something that happens inside. And the difference is a major difference. But this difference cannot be demonstrated, cannot be proved. It must be experienced and lived. So let's try to go to the next one. It seems you say that I believe it is egocentric practices are empty vehicles. What God forms and egregores, if any, does the Rosy Cross School work with? Well, that's a very good question. Still from Thomas. As we mentioned before, in front of the reality or the recognition that all attempts to try to overcome ego through ego are empty, as you said. The school does not utilize any kind of esoteric or occult or natural magic practices. The only effort of the pupil of the school is to regain self-awareness, regain lucidity, regain a true inner self-knowledge. Based on this true self-knowledge, it is possible to change the other 4 aspects of our manifestation. And if this is something, that may sound a little bit individualistic, and if it's only self-observation or self-knowledge, one could say, well, then why do we need a school in the first place? Well, if we said that we don't have masters and we don't have gurus, why is it that we need a school? Or why is it that we have a school to begin with? The purpose of a school is to form what we call today in science an information field, or as it was called in the past, a power field, or even an egregora, as you have mentioned, which is a collective construction with the lines of power, with the lines of force created impersonally by the group that has gone or is going through an inner transformation. This power field, this information field, is just like a leverage that may allow the human consciousness to regain some self-objectivity, to have some perspective in relation to his or her automatic reactions, to her identification processes. Because if we try to go this path on our own, all alone, our identifications, our automatic reactions are so strong, our conditioning is so strong that, it would be almost impossible for us to overcome the veils of our own self-illusion. So that's why the main objective of creating a group in a spiritual school is to create that impersonal field of power lines, of lines of force, where the result of the collective transformation can become a source of support, a source of leverage for each individual. But it is important to stress that this by no means is coercion. This is not forcing or imposing a method or a group on an individual. Because even if a pupil of a spiritual school may count on that information field, on that power field, he or her must follow his or her own path in absolute freedom and self-responsibility. So I hope that we've been able to address your question. So let us try to go to the next one now. If I'm able to open my phone. Let's see. So our friend Eddie Thiel, or Thiel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, would like to learn more about the control of the ego. Huh? Well, friends, the path proposed by the spiritual school is actually not a path to control the ego. Because normally, any attempt to try to control the ego is done by the ego itself. It is just like that funny image of the Baron of Munchausen, a person trying to push himself or herself out of a swamp by pulling its own hair, So it's important that we realize that any attempt to try to control our ego will end up making or creating additional layers of this egocentric consciousness that we carry as a fundamental barrier. So actually the process is not to control ego, but to become, in the first place, aware and self-aware that we are prisoners of ego. That everything that we believe, that we think, desire, feel, or act freely are not free actions or thoughts or desires or perceptions. They are a result of a heavy conditioning, a heavy set of automatic reactions that we carry. And the collective or the sum of those automatic reactions or that identification processes or, that lack of perception or objective perception is what we call ego. So for the ego to be transmuted, we must, in the first place, become aware of the prison that it represents to us in every single aspect of our lives. And the process of a spiritual school is not to try to control ego or to impose methods to it, to transform it in a forced manner, but actually detach the human consciousness from all that set of automatic reactions, conditionings, and identifications. And through that space, through that open space, regain some initial degree of freedom. And within the boundaries of that initial degree of freedom is that the human consciousness can once again move itself, perceive itself in a totally different manner, and regain gradually its objectivity. Let's go to the next question. Why our friend Michael Monier asks, why would the perfect microcosm fall? Well, everything, honestly, Michael, anything that we could say about this would be in the realm of speculation. What we can articulate are some answers based on principles, and draw some parallels with our own lives, because we know, according to the principles of the universal teaching, that there is a correspondence law in every manifestation. So through our own lives, we can understand the lives of any life wave, including the life wave of the human microcosm. But we are not prisoners because life was created as a prison. We are prisoners because our own state of consciousness has created this prison that we live in. So if we, in our lives, that we may call, symbolically speaking, of course, a fallen life, right? A life that is detached from the original universal life in our current state of consciousness. If we can recognize that even here, what happens to us is a matter of choice, drawing a parallel, we can obviously understand that this should also be the case for the original universal, we could also symbolically say divine microcosm. That microcosm would never be put into a predetermined, forced path, even if it was the universal path, because no God can create another God and put it in chains, even if it is chains of freedom. So that microcosm was put in front of options, of choices. And the life that we live today is a consequence of choices. Just like the life that will live tomorrow is based on consequences as well. So one way to look at that is that the law of choice is actually the law of love. The universal law of love that allows every being in the universe to follow its own course, its own path based on its own state of consciousness. So that's one way to look at that. I hope it helps in your reflections. So let's move to the next ones. Eddie is asking us how he can join the Golden Rosy Cross for more learning. Eddie, we actually have, let's say, two main initiatives. One set of initiatives and activities is what we call the public work. In the public work, we are going to explain this at length, we hope, in the end. But in the public work, we have conferences, we have seminars, we have virtual meetings just like we are having now. We have face-to-face meetings, we have literature. We also have visits to our centers. And this is aimed at giving to the seeker the opportunity to get to know the knowledge of the school and the working proposal of the school. And if there is an inner recognition of that working proposal, not a transmission of knowledge, because actually the transmission of true knowledge, of first-hand knowledge is impossible. What we can only do is through words, through symbols, through images, try to awaken one in another the knowledge that already lies in ourselves. And when this knowledge is awakened, then we can call an inner recognition. So if there is a resonance, if there is an inner recognition, then it is possible that after this period of knowing the school through all this material, and what we also call an exploration course that may be made available to a seeker after his or her first contact with the school, then it is possible, if the person is really interested, that he or she becomes a pupil of the school. And then not only we learn about a teaching or a knowledge, but we have the opportunity to put that knowledge into practice in our own lives. And actually, this is the true objective of the school. Not only to transmit a knowledge, but to be a vehicle for a true transformation for the human being. Let's try to address the next one. The question comes from Carla Santos. How can I know to identify, or how can I identify that I am going through an inner transformation? That's a very good question. We tend to say that life may be a path, or maybe a merry-go-round. A merry-go-round that turns endlessly in the desert of life. The passage of time, external time, actually does not tell if we are going through an inner transformation or not. And the key, one of the keys that we can utilize, with ourselves and in ourselves, is to actually observe if our life is merely a set of repetitive experiences, that time and again show up, maybe with different names, in different places, in apparently different circumstances, but in essence are the same. And those experiences are actually the experiences that represent the main themes, the recurrent themes of our consciousness. And if after years and decades, or eventually an entire life, we are living the same experiences, the same core situations, it would be hard to say that we are going through an inner transformation. An inner transformation actually cannot be measured by the change of the external circumstances. But it is the way that we react to the apparently same experiences that may transform our lives from a vicious cycle or circle into a spiral of learning. So how can we recognize one way or another, or one path or the other? By looking at ourselves and seeing if our life is actually becoming a spiral of learning, or just a mere set of repetitive experiences. That's one way to look at that. I hope it helped you. And the last one that comes from Gil Araújo. Is suffering a way to awake, or is it a trap? Well, it depends. There is one text of the school that asks the pupil a fundamental question when he or she is faced with suffering. The question is more or less this one: who in you suffers? Your ego because of its countless attachments to itself, or your soul because of its yearning for true transformation, for true liberation? And the answer is given or suggested as the suffering of the ego is in essence useless. Because attachment only generates pain, as Buddha already explained in the past. So attachment is actually suffering. Because the moment that we attach ourselves to an image of our existence, to an image of our ego, to the shadow that we project in the reality of life, then we are already suffering, because we want to retain that image. We want to retain that shadow in an ever-changing world. And we want to manifest eternity, immutability in the world of phenomena. So that's a suffering to begin with. And it is useless because it doesn't change. But the other kind of suffering, that is the suffering of the yearning of the human consciousness that has been awakened by the Spirit, that suffering may be a leverage for transformation. It's not a useless suffering, because it is the inner confrontation between the image of a true reality and the reality that we have created to ourselves and to all around us with our own egocentric consciousness. That perception that we may eventually call pain, but in essence it's not pain, it's true perception, is the perception that may lead the human soul to a true liberation. Well, dear friends, this is the last question, so that we can conclude this meeting within the time frame of approximately 1 hour. We would like to thank you for your presence, your kindness, your participation, your attention. And before we conclude, we would like to give you a couple of important pieces of information. For those that would like to know more about the school, in our Facebook page, and we believe that most of you, since you are watching this virtual conference through our Facebook page, most of you have found about the school through the Facebook page. So in that particular page, there is one tab for those that speak other languages, languages other than English, and that we have the information for the specific Facebook pages and its corresponding website in different languages, not only in English, but also in Spanish, in Dutch, in French, in Italian, in Portuguese, and several other languages. We hope that we can meet again on a monthly basis. We'll make an effort to keep the rhythm of these virtual conferences on a monthly basis. So in February, probably towards the end of the month, we'll get back to you through Facebook to inform you about the date. That is probably going to be also on a Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will also post the videos of these conferences, of this particular conference, and the following ones. We already have a couple of videos in our Facebook page at the Golden Rosy Cross page. And our intention is also to make available to you a nice series of podcasts that you can listen while you cannot necessarily be looking at the screen of your phone or your tablet or computer. And also, and now this is especially for the public that live in the States, more importantly on the East Coast and West Coast. In New York City, we have already established a monthly calendar of face-to-face meetings of the public work in a very similar format that we had our meeting today, with an introduction and then a session of questions and answers. And the next one is already scheduled for February the 5th. So we please ask you to refer to the Facebook page where you can find more information about it. The calendar of the following months will be published as we move into the year. And also, for those that live on the West Coast, especially for the region of Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area. We are planning to start, if possible, the same sort of public work activities, face-to-face public conferences around the middle of the year in June. So we'll try to keep you posted about those meetings. And finally, for those that would like to read more about the teaching of the school, you can find several books available in English and in other languages as well on Amazon. If you just type Golden Rosy Cross or the equivalent name of the school in different languages, and some sites of the school, Facebook sites and websites, they also have those books available for free that you can download in PDF or eventually in formats like ebook and similar ones. So we'd like to conclude now with a big and final thanks to each one of you. Thank you for participating in this virtual conference of the Golden Rosy Cross, and we hope to see you again very soon through Facebook or face-to-face. Thank you very much and have a good evening.